This story is based on a real case. The names of the individuals and the location have been changed to protect their privacy. Some stories never make the headlines. Some tragedies are only whispered in academic circles or behind closed doors in forensic psychology seminars. The story of David and Miriam Walker and their infant daughter Gloria is one of those cases. The Walkers lived in a small town called Elder Spring, tucked away in the forests of Oregon. The town had just over 3,000 residents, a quiet, peaceful place where everyone knew everyone. David worked at a small electronics repair shop. Miriam was a part-time librarian at the local church. They were quiet, polite, and private, the kind of couple you might nod to at the grocery store but never really get to know. People in Elder Spring remember them as soft-spoken and gentle. David had a thin build and always looked a little tired. Miriam wore long gray dresses and always carried a worn-out Bible, its cover frayed from use. After years of trying without success, the Walkers began to withdraw from the community. Miriam stopped attending church regularly. She quit her job. David asked to switch to night shifts, avoiding most people entirely. Then, in the middle of a cold winter, they made an announcement. Miriam was pregnant. No one knew how it happened, whether they had sought treatment or relied on faith, but to them, this child was a miracle from heaven. Miriam believed that the baby growing inside her was a divine answer to their prayers. At first, it was subtle. She told David she could hear whispers at night, a soft female voice saying that the child is special. She spoke of dreams filled with blinding light, where a faceless figure emerged and gently touched her stomach, saying, "Don't let the world corrupt her." David didn't know whether to be afraid or hopeful, but Miriam's eyes glistened with conviction. "Don't you believe me?" she asked him one night. "I feel angels around me every day." Around that time, Miriam's reading habits changed. She no longer read just the Bible, but collected strange, old religious texts, obscure volumes ordered from the internet. A neighbor, Claire, once glimpsed a stack of books on their dining table titled things like The Purity of the Infant Soul and Spiritual Cleansing in the Age of Industry. Though there was no hard evidence, some suspected that Miriam had become active in online religious extremist forums, obscure groups that promoted absolute spiritual purity for infants, warning against modern medicine, vaccinations, formula feeding, and even strangers' gazes. David, at first hesitant, slowly gave in. Miriam's words, her calm intensity, her nightly prayers, they filled him with the sense that something divine really was unfolding. He didn't want to be the one to doubt the miracle. David delivered the baby himself. They informed no one except a distant friend who shared their beliefs. Gloria was small, underweight, but Miriam believed that was a sign of spiritual lightness. She named the child Gloria, meaning glory. In the months that followed, they lived in near total isolation. The windows were always covered. No one saw them leave the house. Miriam fed the baby with a homemade formula, diluted milk and herbal extracts, a recipe she claimed came to her in a dream. David didn't object. He no longer made decisions. In his eyes, Miriam was no longer just his wife. She was a vessel, and he was the guardian of the chosen one. Gloria grew up in silence, no music, no laughter. Just whispered prayers, candlelight, the scent of dried herbs hanging on the walls, and a Bible opened to the same page every day. As the days passed, Miriam spoke more and more to her angels, and less to David. She wrote pages and pages in her journal, documenting messages she claimed to receive. The outside world is unclear. The Walkers' home sat quietly at the edge of Elder Spring, its curtains drawn, its garden overgrown. Neighbors walked past it every day and said little, if anything at all. It had been months since anyone had seen Miriam or David outside, and even longer since they'd heard the faint cry of a baby. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, not with grief or fear, but with devotion. Miriam spent most of her days in prayer. She knelt beside Gloria's crib, muttering ancient phrases copied from books no one else could read. The air smelled of frankincense and dried sage, burning slowly in bowls by the window. The walls were covered with Bible verses, handwritten in shaky black ink, alongside symbols traced from spiritual texts Miriam had collected online. She believed that her daughter was chosen, the vessel of light, as she often whispered, and that the world outside was trying to corrupt her. So she created rules. Gloria must not be touched by anyone other than Miriam. No medicine, no visitors, no plastic toys. Her food must be clean, free from man-made chemicals, even sugar. Miriam created a homemade formula from goat's milk, boiled water, and herbs. She believed it was enough. David followed the rules. He never argued, never raised his voice. His devotion to Miriam had shifted from husbandly love to something more like reverence. She had become, in his mind, a prophet, a messenger of divine wisdom, and he was her faithful shadow. At first, David didn't believe the voices Miriam spoke of. When she woke him in the middle of the night, claiming to have heard whispers from angels, he listened in silence, assuming it was just a vivid dream or the anxiety of pregnancy. But over time, Miriam changed the way she spoke to him. She didn't scream, she didn't demand, she guided. "David," she whispered once as they sat on the floor in dim candlelight, "do you remember when we begged for a child? And now she's here against all odds. Doesn't that tell you something?" David nodded slowly. "She wasn't given to us by chance," Miriam continued. "She was sent, and the world, this poisoned world, it will try to take her from us." She would read aloud passages from obscure texts, quoting visions from mystics and martyrs. But more than that, she used David's love, his most vulnerable part, to make her case. "You're her father. You're meant to protect her even from the world itself. Don't let fear make you weak. Don't let their science replace our faith." At first, David pushed back, but what if we're wrong? Miriam's voice never rose. She simply placed Gloria into his arms and said, "Look at her. Does she look like she belongs to them or to something higher?" That moment stayed with David, the baby's eyes, large and innocent, gazing up at him in the candlelight. The silence, the warmth of Miriam's hand on his shoulder. He wanted to be strong for them. He wanted to believe. Over the weeks, Miriam built a world for him, brick by brick, out of symbols, dreams, scriptures, and a kind of spiritual logic that wrapped tightly around his grief, his awe, and his deep, aching need for meaning. David stopped asking questions. He let Miriam lead. He told himself that he wasn't surrendering his reason, he was choosing faith. Each night, the couple held silent, cleansing rituals. They lit candles, anointed Gloria's forehead with oil, and recited psalms for hours. Miriam said this was necessary to protect the baby's soul from the sickness of the world. David began documenting Miriam's visions in a notebook. "The light is watching," she once said. "We are being tested. If we let darkness in even a drop, she will be taken from us." Sometimes she would wake David in the middle of the night, trembling. "They're trying to reach her," she whispered. "The radio signals, the water, even the air. We must keep her sealed." David listened. He stopped bringing bottled water home. He unplugged the refrigerator. He refused to let the neighbor's cat walk near their porch, afraid it carried secular vibrations. One day, Miriam announced that God had spoken again, this time through the crying of a bird. "We have to separate ourselves completely," she said. "We are the last remnant." That week, they cut off their internet. Miriam stopped using phones. They boarded up the mailbox. They no longer waved to the mailman. From the outside, the house looked abandoned. From the inside, it was a shrine. Gloria was now 4 months old. Her weight was far below average. She no longer cried with strength. Her sounds were faint, almost whispers. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes dull, barely tracking movement. Miriam interpreted this as a sign of spiritual elevation. She is shedding her earthly weight, she told David. She is becoming light. But Gloria was not becoming light, she was slipping away. She had not seen a doctor since birth. She had not received vaccines, nor a single proper feeding. Her body was starving, David noticed. One morning, as he cradled her, her skin felt papery, her breath short. He asked Miriam gently, "Should we call someone?" Miriam turned to him sharply, her face pale and stern. "Call who?" "The ones who poison children, the ones who would put her under fluorescent lights and fill her blood with toxins. You want to hand her over to them." David lowered his eyes. He said nothing more. The Walkers had become invisible. Their rent was paid on time, but their trash bins were always empty. They never shopped in town. They no longer attended church. Even the one neighbor who used to drop off groceries stopped trying after the fifth unanswered knock. Then came the letter from Child Services. An anonymous report had been filed, likely by the same neighbor. The letter was slipped under their door. Miriam read it and began to weep, but not in fear, in rage. "They're coming," she said. "We have 7 days." David asked what she meant. 7 days to prepare," she said. 7 days to prove our faith." She began fasting. She stopped sleeping. She claimed she could see spirits outside the windows, whispering, scratching, waiting. She stopped feeding Gloria altogether for 2 days, insisting that the child needed a final cleanse. David tried to intervene. "She's hungry," he said. "She's too weak." The morning that broke the silence began like any other in Elder Spring, cold, still, quiet. But outside the Walker house, a black and white patrol car pulled up slowly to the curb. It was a young officer named Rachel Finn, responding to a welfare check request. A neighbor, an older woman named Claire, had called in the day before. She hadn't seen Miriam or David in over 2 months. The mailbox was overflowing. There was a strange odor when the wind blew east, and once, just once, she thought she saw candlelight flickering through a boarded window at 3 in the morning. Claire didn't want to believe anything was wrong. But something in her stomach told her to make the call. Officer Finn knocked 3 times, no answer. She stepped back, took a deep breath, and called dispatch. Another patrol was sent, then a supervisor. With no sign of forced entry, no movement inside, and a lingering, sour smell in the air, they obtained a warrant for a wellness entry. When they finally opened the door, what they found was something they'd only read about in training manuals. The house was dark. All windows were covered in heavy black cloth. Candles had burned down to puddles of wax across nearly every surface. Religious symbols hung crookedly on the walls, scribbled Bible verses lined the hallways, and the air was thick, a mix of dust, decay, and incense long burned out. At the center of the living room, surrounded by flickering electric lights strung up like halos, was a wooden crib. Inside was Gloria, wrapped tightly in a white cloth, a rosary between her tiny hands. Her skin had turned pale gray. Her body was cold. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, no violence, just silence. And David and Miriam were kneeling on either side of the crib, whispering to themselves. The officers didn't raise their voices. They didn't draw their weapons. What they saw was fragile, a delusion hardened into ritual. When asked how long the baby had been there, David answered quietly, 2 nights she's resting. Miriam looked up at the officers with calm eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "This is sacred ground." One officer gently reached for the crib. Miriam screamed, "Don't touch her." It was the first time her voice had risen above a whisper in weeks. David stood between the officer and the crib, hands out. "Please." "She's not gone, she's waiting. The light hasn't finished its work." It took over 30 minutes to convince them to move away from the crib. Miriam clung to Gloria's tiny hand. David kept repeating a single phrase, "This isn't what you think." Eventually, paramedics stepped in. They gently lifted the baby's body. Miriam sobbed but didn't resist. David turned away, staring at the floor, motionless. They were both escorted outside. Miriam asked where they were taking Gloria. "She needs to be examined," said the female officer. Miriam nodded, whispering, "She'll wake up soon. She needs sunlight. We kept her too long in the dark." David, sitting on the steps, whispered to himself, "We were just trying to protect her." The coroner's report would later confirm what the paramedics already suspected. Cause of death: severe malnutrition and dehydration. Estimated time of death: 2 to 3 days before discovery. Gloria had weighed only 6 pounds at the time of death, far below a healthy weight for her age. There were no signs of physical abuse, no injuries, just a prolonged absence of basic care. The report was quiet, clinical. But for those who read it, it was one of the most haunting documents they'd ever handled. News didn't spread far. The case was kept quiet, partially to protect the privacy of the child, partially because mental illness made the story too complex for a single headline. But in Elder Spring, the whispers began. They were so quiet. "We never imagined. She seemed so devoted." The courtroom was small, almost claustrophobic. A modest county courthouse in rural Oregon, wooden pews, scuffed floor, the air stale with silence. There were no cameras, no media circus. Just a few observers, lawyers, and a judge with tired eyes. David and Miriam Walker sat side by side, both in pale gray clothing, hands folded, eyes low. They didn't speak to each other. They hadn't since the night Gloria was taken from the crib. She was buried 3 weeks earlier in a quiet cemetery outside Elder Spring. No family claimed the body, no flowers. Just a plain white headstone with her name, her birth date, and the date she left the world too soon. The Walkers were charged with manslaughter in the first degree, criminally negligent homicide, endangering the welfare of a minor. But from the beginning, it was clear this was no ordinary case. There were no bruises, no violent acts, only conviction, delusion, and a shared, dangerous faith. The judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. 3 doctors were assigned. They spent weeks reviewing journals, recordings, Miriam's annotated books, and hours of quiet interviews. Their diagnosis came back unanimous. Miriam Walker suffered from chronic delusional disorder with religious grandiosity. David Walker exhibited symptoms of shared psychotic disorder, known clinically as folie à deux. Their belief system was internally consistent but completely detached from reality. Dr. Evans, the lead forensic psychiatrist, testified, "Mr. Walker did not create the delusion, he absorbed it. His participation was not driven by malice, but by submission to Miriam's constructed reality." On the 3rd day of the hearing, Miriam asked to speak. The room was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. She stood slowly. Her voice, thin and quiet, filled the room. "We didn't mean to hurt her. We thought we were saving her. The world is full of poison, of things that strip away innocence, one syringe, one screen, one idea at a time. We thought if we kept her close, if we kept her clean, the light would protect her. I know now that she's gone. But I don't believe it was death. I believe she stepped over, and I would rather join her than stay in this world that let this happen." She sat down, no tears, no hysteria. Just the soft certainty of a woman whose mind no longer lived here. When it was his turn, David hesitated. He looked toward the empty space where Miriam had sat, then at the lawyers, then down at his hands. "I loved them both. I wasn't strong. I knew something was wrong. I knew Gloria was getting worse, but I couldn't break her heart. I couldn't be the one to shatter what Miriam believed. She made me feel like we were chosen, like we were holy. And I wanted to believe her more than I wanted to face the truth." He stopped, voice cracked. "I held my daughter when she was cold, and I still believed she might wake up." The court, with heavy consideration, accepted the psychiatric findings. David and Miriam Walker were found not guilty by reason of insanity on the charge of manslaughter. guilty of criminal negligence, with the condition of mandatory psychiatric treatment in a state mental facility. They were ordered to remain under medical supervision indefinitely, with regular evaluations to determine whether they could ever be safely released. They were not allowed to see each other again. In the weeks that followed, Elder Spring returned to quiet. The Walker house was eventually sold, its insides gutted, the candles scraped off the floors. Some say you can still smell sage in the walls, others don't like to talk about it at all. The therapists who worked with David say he still wakes in the night, calling Gloria's name. Miriam stopped speaking entirely. In her file, nurses wrote, "She hums sometimes. It's the same melody every time. No one recognizes it." Some say this story is about mad. They called it a tragedy. They called it delusion. But in the world of forensic psychiatry, what happened to David and Miriam Walker had a name: folie deux, the madness of two. A rare and deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon in which delusions are shared between closely connected individuals, often in a closed, isolated environment. It's not science fiction. It's not metaphor. It's real. And in the case of the Walkers, it ended with the death of a child. The term comes from French. It means madness of two. It describes a psychiatric condition where one person, the primary, suffers from a severe delusional disorder, and another, the secondary, adopts and internalizes those delusions as their own. They don't just believe together, they live inside the same constructed reality. They reinforce it in each other until even the most irrational beliefs feel like unshakable truth. This disorder often arises in intensely close relationships: siblings, couples, parents, and children, people bound by love, dependency, and fear. But when one leads and the other follows blindly, reality becomes optional. Miriam was the origin of the delusion. She had long-standing traits of paranoid ideation, religious obsession, and an increasing detachment from the outside world. Experts believe her pregnancy acted as a psychological trigger, a deeply emotional event that caused her fragile belief system to collapse inward. She began to experience what clinicians call delusions of purity and persecution. She believed the world was corrupt. Her child was divine, and she, as the mother, was chosen to protect her from sin. Over time, her beliefs hardened into rules. No medicine, no outsiders, no deviation. Her entire identity became bound to her role as protector of the light. But what made her dangerous wasn't just the belief, it was her conviction, her calmness, her certainty. Her ability to explain the madness in a way that sounded like devotion. She didn't scream, she preached, and in doing so, she pulled David in. David had no prior history of mental illness, but he was vulnerable, quiet, emotionally dependent, desperate for meaning after years of infertility and isolation. And above all, he loved his wife, loved her deeply, even as she began to drift away from reason. He didn't believe at first. But Miriam didn't demand belief, she gave him purpose. He wasn't just a husband anymore, he was a guardian of the chosen one. Experts believe David's transformation was textbook folie impasse, a subtype of shared psychosis where the secondary individual passively adopts the dominant delusions of the primary. He gave up his doubts piece by piece, first by allowing the rituals, then by agreeing to isolate, eventually by watching his daughter weaken and saying nothing. He wasn't psychotic by nature, he was taken by the logic of love. And once inside the delusion, he no longer had the strength to escape. Gloria Walker was never given a chance to be her own person. She was born into a belief system that treated her body as a vessel, not a life. She wasn't abused in the traditional sense, there were no bruises, no beatings, but she was slowly starved of food, of care, of the basic necessities of survival. To Miriam and David, it wasn't cruelty, it was obedience. Obedience to a belief that didn't belong to the world. Cases like the Walkers are terrifying not because they are violent, but because they are quiet, because they are built on love. Because they don't involve rage or hatred, but affection, prayer, trust. And that's what makes them so hard to detect, so difficult to intervene in, and so tragic to watch unfold. They remind us that even the purest bonds, marriage, family, devotion, can twist in the dark when isolated from reason and community. And sometimes, the monsters don't live under the bed. Some stories leave us shaken, others leave us changed. The case of the Walkers is not just a tragedy, it's a mirror. A dark reflection of how love without reason, faith without questioning, and isolation without help can lead to irreversible harm. Their story forces us to ask difficult questions. What would I do if someone I love began to lose touch with reality? How far would I go to protect a belief I wanted to be true? At what point does love become complicity? Mental illness is not always loud. It can look like devotion, like routine, like religious passion or harmless obsession. But when beliefs begin to harm others, especially children, silence becomes dangerous. Isolation feeds delusion. The Walkers cut themselves off from family, church, neighbors. They created an echo chamber where only their beliefs existed. If someone you know is withdrawing deeply from community, don't ignore the signs. Love is not a reason to look away. David didn't act out of hate. He acted out of fear, loyalty, and dependence. But none of those things protected Gloria. Love must come with responsibility, especially when children are involved. Early intervention saves lives. If you suspect abuse, neglect, or signs of dangerous beliefs, speak up. One small act, a phone call, a wellness check, could be the moment that interrupts a downward spiral. If you or someone you know is struggling with obsessive beliefs, feels the world is unsafe or unclean, shows signs of detachment from reality, is isolating a child in the name of protection, please reach out to a doctor, a therapist, a crisis hotline, or even a trusted friend. Sometimes all it takes to break the cycle of shared delusion is one outside voice. Thank you for walking with us through this difficult story. At Rose and Crimes, we believe in telling true crime with empathy, depth, and understanding, not just of what happened, but why it happened. If this story moved you, made you think, or taught you something new, please like, subscribe, and share this video to support our work. Let us know in the comments what stood out to you the most in the Walker case.